Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Psalm 22, where we read a cry from the cross. I'd like to begin not with verse 1, but going back to the superscription for the choir director upon Yeleth ha-Shashar, and then a Psalm of David. Now, notice that phrase, upon Ayelet ha-Shashar. Literally, the Hebrew there has the idea upon the deer of the, and I rendered this the pre-dawn light. That's only one word, but we don't have an English word to actually have that. Dawn maybe works, but it's actually talking about the light. You know how the light begins to light up just before the sun. It's not even rising yet. It's just beginning to, and they had a word for that. Now, the question is, what does that mean? Is it a type of musical instrument? Is it a type of a tune? Maybe just like the way the sky begins to light up, maybe the tune begins very, very softly and then rises in its force. I think of that opening tune from the old movie 2001: Space Odyssey. I'm not going to try to sing it, you remember, but very the tune as the sun begins to rise, you hear that da da da, and I'm not going to try to sing it because my voice won't hold up. But it's perhaps that idea. Now, this is a Psalm of David, and as such, it's going to describe a difficult time in David's life. But everyone who reads this, both Christians and even our Jewish friends, think there's more to the story than that. Because yes, David went through some difficult times, but he didn't go through anything like what is going to be described in this story. I think David does write it with himself in mind, but I think it's more than that. And so this psalm has been looked at by a great many, both Christians and non-Christians, as a prophecy looking toward the future. Now, our Jewish friends look at this as a prophecy of the Esther story, and I guess there might be a few elements that might connect, but as we read it, I think that will fall far short as well. I think instead, we Christians are drawn to see the picture of Jesus on the cross, especially with the opening words that are actually cited by Jesus. Jesus actually says the opening words of the psalm when we get to the next verse, verse 1. Um, and that makes me think that perhaps Jesus was deliberately invoking the psalm and indeed maybe even praying through the psalm as he was upon the cross. Now, you're not going to have any other specific word for word quotes, but I think there will be allusions all throughout the psalm to things that Jesus said and that were done and said at the cross. And so we begin, my God, why have you forsaken me? Both in the Hebrew there, Ali, Ali, lama azbachthani. Now you say, wait a second. When I read Matthew 27, verse 46, and also Mark 15:34, it actually doesn't it give me the Hebrew? And it sounds a little bit different. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani is the way it goes there. And I think what's happening, why the difference, isn't because Matthew doesn't know Hebrew, but rather I think perhaps he was quoting the Aramaic, and even though Jesus, he could speak Hebrew, I think he probably could take in Aramaic as well. And what we seem to have is the Aramaic version that is cited in those two passages. So was Jesus speaking Aramaic or Hebrew? Now remember, those two languages are very close. They come from a common root. Just like if you want to hear Latin, go to Italy and then go to Spain and then go to Portugal, and you're going to hear three languages that are very, very close. They're not the same. They've changed over the last 2,000 years, and Aramaic and Hebrew had done the same thing. So we start off, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus uttered those words on the cross, indicating that there was something about his suffering and his very being upon the cross that reflected some sort of spiritual forsaking. I think it was more than just the fact that this was painful, that this was humiliating, and it was those things. But this was more than that. Notice the next line. Far from my deliverance are the words of my groaning. That term groaning, three other times where it's used, and it's used a few times, but three of those times where it's used elsewhere in the Old Testament, it's describing the sound that a lion makes, not like when he's burping, but the roar of a lion. So I would render this roaring. In other words, he didn't. I don't think he just whispered those words. I think, I think he screamed those words, my God, why have you forsaken me? And those words burst forth from his lips, indicating something spiritual that was taking place there upon the cross. The psalm continues, "Oh my God, I cry by day, and you do not answer, and by night, but I have no rest." And remember that the arrest of Jesus had actually taken place the night prior, and then he had been on trial first before Annas, and then Caiaphas, and then the Sanhedrin, and then before Pilate and Herod Antipas, and back before Pilate. If we put all of the different Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all together, it had been day and night. But notice, yet you are holy. O you, and he's speaking about God, O you who are enthroned upon the praises of Israel. Now, when you talk about the throne of God, God was seated, as it were, upon a throne, and of course, his throne was the temple. Heaven is his throne, the earth is his footstool. But they sort of imagined the place where God's presence was made known was there in the temple. If you were to go to the place where most scholars think is the likely location of Golgotha, today there's a big sort of a big, very ornate church there. I wish they had just left it the way it was in the first century, but they didn't. And today that's inside the later walls of Jerusalem. But back then, in the first century, that was actually outside the city walls. But if you had been there on Golgotha and looked toward the temple, notice the temple was facing toward the east. It was facing in the other direction, as if maybe to say that God had turned his back upon the cross. Now, don't take that too literally, but I think perhaps the imagery comes forth here. Our passage continues, verse 4. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted, and notice the reference to the fathers. They trusted, and you delivered them. So it's speaking of the Old Testament saints. You delivered them. To you they cried out and were delivered. In you they trusted and were not disappointed. Here we have this cry, Lord, the fathers trusted in you. Why can't I? Why have you forsaken me? And so this is a look to the past, but then we come to verse 6. Now we come to the present. But I am a worm and not a man, a reproach of men, and despised by the people. So he sees himself as a reproach, despised. Notice all who see me sneer at me. They separate with the lip. That's sort of a Middle Eastern thing. Even today, I've been in the Middle East where people wanted to do something that was very disrespectful, and they do this thing with their lips. I can't make the sound they make, but it comes forth, and I didn't understand it the first time I heard it. I remember I talked to my guide later on. My wife and I had been out on the streets of a Middle Eastern city. I won't mention which one it is. And some things had happened. I asked my guide, the next morning, and he said, "Oh, that was the sign of disrespect." I didn't get it at the time. I sort of thought that might be the case, but it's a cultural thing. They separate with the lip. They wag the head, saying, and notice what they say: "Commit yourself to the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, because he delights in him." So you have this mockery taking place. And again, do you remember what took place on the cross, where there was mockery, and Jesus actually prayed from the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing." And so, again, these things are reflected here in this psalm. Verse 9, yet you are he who brought me forth. And notice the references here. There's several connected references. You brought me forth from the womb. You made me trust upon my mother's breast. Upon you I was cast from birth. You have been my God from my mother's womb. And that draws our attention to something also that took place upon the cross, something that dealt with the mother of Jesus. And you remember the story where Jesus saw his mother, and there's this unnamed disciple that was there with her, the disciple whom he loved, he's called, standing nearby, and he said to his mother, "Woman." Now he doesn't mean that's not disrespectful. That's a title of respect. Woman, behold your son. And in verse 27, then he turned to the disciple, this unnamed disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own household. So that reference to the womb and the mother's breast, the birth, the mother's womb, that's addressed from the cross. It's an echo of what took place in that conversation as Jesus entrusted his earthly mother, the one who gave birth to him, to this disciple. Verse 11, our psalm continues, be not far from me, for trouble is near, for there's none to help. Many bulls have surrounded me, strong bulls of Bashan. Remember, Bashan was on the east side of the Jordan, these big plains where there were, apparently there were bulls that were known there. And the picture of these bulls, not just they're grazing, but they've surrounded him. They open wide their mouths at me as a ravening and a roaring lion. So bulls, lion, we're going to see one other animal in just a bit. Verse 14, I am poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. Now, as I said, I think David maybe is feeling this way sort of metaphorically. But Jesus went through this physically. Try hanging by your hands for hours and hours, and that's going to dislocate your shoulders. Um, my heart is like wax; it is melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd. My tongue cleaves to my jaws, and you lay me in the dust of death. Notice that part about my tongue cleaves to my jaws. Again, that reminds us of something that Jesus said upon the cross. Remember, he says, John chapter 19, verse 28, I thirst. And there's a reference there where the one who is from whom we get our living water, he suffered thirst so that our thirst, our spiritual thirst, could be quenched. Verse 16, for dogs, remember we had ox or bulls, and we had lions, and now we have dogs. And we're going to see reference to all three of those again. That's why I'm circling them. For dogs have surrounded me. And so he's speaking of those who are his enemies. The band of evildoers has encompassed me. That's describing the same person. The dogs, the band of evildoers, they've surrounded me. They've encompassed me. That's the same thing. And then they pierced my hands and my feet. David may have felt like these things were metaphorically happening. Jesus actually had this take place. Nails in his hands, nails in his feet, as he suffered what was not a form of punishment when David wrote these words. Nobody had invented crucifixion yet, but that was a Roman form of punishment 1,000 years later when Jesus went to the cross. Verse 17, I can count all my bones. They stare at me. Just imagine what your body feels like as you're hanging in the sky. Verse 18, they divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. You remember the story of the soldiers at the cross who took his clothing. When they would crucify them, they wouldn't crucify somebody with all their clothes on. They would take all those things off, and they divided them up among them. And yet his outer robe, they said, well, there's no seam there. Let's, instead of just ripping it apart, let's cast the dice. Let's roll the lots, cast the lots to see whose it will be. Literally, this took place at the cross. Verse 19, but you, O Lord, be not far off. O you, my help, hasten to my assistance. Remember how we started off, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now here is a supplication. So be not far off, O you of my help, say, hasten to my assistance. Deliver my soul from the sword, my only life from the power. You notice the dog? Save me from the lion's mouth, from the horns of the wild oxen, sort of like the bulls that were mentioned earlier. Answer me. So all of those things sort of come back at us as we see this prayer of supplication. And of course, Jesus had prayed a prayer like that before going to the cross. Remember, on the night prior to his arrest, the night of his arrest, he had been in Gethsemane, and he had prayed, Lord, if there's any way, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but may your will be done. And he had prayed that not once, but twice, as he prayed for deliverance. And so he prayed, and yet now, as he is upon that cross, that prayer is answered in a different way, where he will not be delivered. He goes through the agony of the cross. He goes through the separation. I don't think just a physical separation. I would suggest a spiritual separation as he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Um, and yet there will be a deliverance. And there will be the deliverance not from the cross, but from death by means of the resurrection. And so notice he closes this as he's praying to the Lord, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And this is going to mark what's going to eventually happen. He doesn't rise here. He's going to be in the grave for 3 days. But on the third day, he will rise. And so verse 22 now, there is going to be a change in tone. You see, there's that call for deliverance, and we see, in a sense, the end of the story, but it's not the end. Instead, verse 22, I will tell of your name to my brethren. In the midst of the assembly, I will praise you. By the way, this passage is quoted in Hebrews chapter 2, where it talks about, so therefore, because of this, he has brethren. And it's not just speaking about his physical brothers. By the way, this can't be Esther. She doesn't have any brothers, unless you're talking about the brothers of Israel. But Jesus, I will tell of your name to my brethren. In the midst of the assembly, I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you descendants, so notice, my brethren, you who fear the Lord, all you descendants of Jacob, glorify him and stand in awe of him. Another way of saying that, all you descendants of Israel. His people, remember how he came to his own. And the next part of that verse is, but his own did not receive him. Of course, some of his own did. His disciples were all Jewish. They were all part of it. And we who believe have become part of that. And I'm getting ahead of myself. We're going to see that in just a minute. Verse 24, for he has not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, nor has he hidden his face from him. But when he cried to him for help, he heard. And so remember one who did cry on the cross. There's one who became, in a sense, his brother. There was that other thief upon the cross. There were actually two. And initially they were both hurling insults as they were between their screams of agony. They were being crucified after all. But one, his heart was changed. And remember what he said to Jesus. He said, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus turned to him, Luke chapter 23, verse 43. Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. That this one who initially had not feared the Lord, but then turns to the companion on the other side of the cross and says, hey, we deserve to be here. He exhibits that fear of the Lord, and he becomes one of the brothers of Jesus. He becomes one who is heard in his request and is given the promise that he will be with Jesus that very day in paradise. And so verse 24, I think, looks at that, for he is not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted. Here was one who was also upon a cross, not for our sins, but for his own. He was a guilty sinner. Nor has he hidden his face from him, but when he cried to him for help, he heard. Jesus did that. And so verse 25, from you comes my praise in the great assembly. I shall pay my vows before those who fear him. Notice the pain of vows. Now, there's an idea there. Let me read verse 26 now. I'm going to come back to that. The afflicted will eat and be satisfied. Those who seek him will praise the Lord. Let your heart live forever. What is this about paying the vows? What Jesus did upon the cross, in a sense, I think it was other things too, but in a sense, it was a payment. And when he died, at the end of that time upon the cross, you remember what Jesus said? John chapter 19, verse 30, it is finished. Tetelestai, a single word. It has been finished is the idea. I'm told, and I have looked this up, there's some fact to this, that when someone owed a debt, now this wasn't the only use of that term, but when someone owed a debt, what you could do to mark that debt paid, you would write the word across the bill of receipt, finished, complete, or we might say paid in full. That the vow had been paid, the penalty had been paid. Jesus died to pay for us, to pay the penalty that we deserved, so that we who trust in him might receive the life that he deserves. And so he says, I shall pay my vows before those who fear him. And indeed, he did that. On the cross, he paid the price for our sins, yours, mine, for all who trust in him. Verse 27, all the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord. Now, I want you to see, this is the results. This is, we're in a sense done with the story of the cross, but now we're going back and looking at the results of that. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord. And notice the references here, the ends of the earth, all the families of the nations will worship before you, for the kingdom is the Lord's, and he rules over the nations. And remember what one of the persons from the nations who was there, the centurion, who was standing right in front of him, saw the way he breathed his last. And he said, truly, this man was the Son of God. The nations gave testimony to who he is, and the nations are still giving testimony. Verse 29, we continue, all the prosperous of the earth will eat and worship. All those who go down to the dust will bow before him. Even he who cannot keep his soul alive. We continue verse 30. Posterity will serve him. It will be told of the Lord to the coming generation. They will come and declare his righteousness to a people who will be born. Notice, who will be born. They hadn't been born yet. To a people who will be born, that he has performed it. Have you? Yes, you've been born. Have you been born again? You see, I think perhaps this reflects in the results, not just what took place on that day, but what has taken place forever after. And those of us that weren't there yet, we weren't born yet. And so that message continues to go out to us, those of the nations who have come to him in faith, have trusted in him, and we can declare his righteousness. Indeed, because of his righteous act, we have also been declared righteous and born again because he has performed it. He has accomplished the work of salvation on our behalf.